I have told this story maybe 4 times in my whole life, and every single time somebody stops me halfway and says, "Wait, he hit her hand." And I say yes. And they say, in front of everyone. And I say yes, in front of 300 people, 2 television cameras, a bishop, and the woman's own mother. And then they lean in, and that's the part I like, because that's when I get to tell them what was actually in the glass. I was 19 years old, and I was a footman at White Hello Palace. You should know right away that footman sounds far grander than it is. What it means is that you carry things. You carry trays, you carry chairs, you carry a folded umbrella 11 paces behind somebody in case it rains, and it never rains, and you carry that umbrella back inside and hang it up, and nobody has ever once said thank you for it. That's the job. I got it because my aunt worked in the linen rooms for 22 years and put my name forward, and because I was tall, which I have since learned is about 80% of the qualification. They like a tall footman. Don't ask me why. Nobody's ever explained it, and I stopped asking around week 3. The summer I'm talking about was the hot one. I don't know how else to date it for you. In Ashcombe, we don't say a year, we say the hot summer, and everyone my age knows exactly which one. The grass in the south lawn went the color of a biscuit. The fountains got switched off for a fortnight because of the reservoirs, and the gardeners went about with faces like a funeral. You could smell the box hedges cooking. That's a real thing. Box hedge in proper heat smells like a cat's been at it, and every year some visitor wrinkles their nose, and every year we pretend not to notice. And in the middle of all that, somebody in the household decided we would hold the garden reception outdoors as normal, at 3 in the afternoon, on the hottest Thursday of the century. Mr. Dunnett, the palace steward, a man with a face like a closed door, said one sentence about it in the servants' hall that I have never forgotten. "We have held it outdoors for 140 years, he said, and I am not going to be the man who stopped. That's Ashcombe for you. Somebody could be actively on fire and we'd hold the reception around them." So the setup. 300 guests on the East Terrace. Charity people, mostly hospice trustees, a children's literacy lot, some doctors, a few military widows, a bishop who kept mopping his forehead with a napkin he'd taken off a tray and clearly wasn't going to give back. Marquees along the edge, striped white and pale green, sagging a bit in the heat. A band playing under the cedar, doing that gentle nothing music that exists purely so silence doesn't happen. And us. 22 of us in service uniform, which in that weather was roughly the same as being buried alive in a wool suit. I had sweat running down the inside of my collar in a steady line, and I could feel it reach my belt, and I remember thinking, quite calmly, I am going to faint into the sandwiches, and it will be on the news. The tourists were pressed up against the north railings because you could see the terrace from the public path if you angled yourself right. Hundreds of them. Phones up. That constant low seaside noise a crowd makes. Somebody's child crying because the ice cream van had gone round the corner. And the guards. Now I need to explain the guards properly, because most of what people think they know about them is rubbish. The Ashcombe household guards stand their posts in scarlet and black, and the great public game is to try and make one of them break. Tourists do it constantly. Sing at them, pull faces, stand next to them and do the little march. Very occasionally somebody touches one, and then they learn something about how quickly a man in ceremonial dress can move, and they learn it fast. But here's what people miss. They think it's a statue thing, a being still competition. It isn't. Standing still is the easy part. Any fool can stand still. The job is watching. That's the whole job. You are a pair of eyes that has been dressed up and put where everybody can see it, so that everybody knows they're being watched, and the ones who shouldn't be there go somewhere else. The stillness is just the costume the watching wears. I learned that from Sergeant Callum Reeve, who is the man this story is about, and who taught me more about paying attention in one summer than school managed in 11 years. Reeve was maybe 30, hard to say. He had one of those faces that could have been 25 or 40 depending on the light and how much sleep he'd had. Not big. That surprised people. They expect the guards to be enormous, and mostly they're just ordinary-sized men with very good posture. He was quiet in the way that some people are loud. You noticed it. In the guardroom, the others would be going on about football or somebody's divorce, and Reeve would be sat in the corner with a mug going cold, listening, occasionally saying one thing that was funnier than everything else that had been said in the previous 10 minutes. and then going quiet again. I liked him because he talked to me. That sounds like nothing. It isn't nothing. There's a hierarchy in a place like Whitehall that isn't written anywhere and is enforced absolutely, and a 19-year-old footman is somewhere near the bottom of it, just above the pigeons. Guards didn't talk to footmen. Reeve talked to everyone. He'd ask me how my mum was doing after her operation, and he'd remember the answer, which I have since discovered is a rarer quality than being clever. And he had this thing. He'd pick up a glass, off a tray, off a sideboard, whatever, and he'd flick it once with his fingernail, ting, and listen. The first few times I thought it was a nervous habit, like clicking a pen. Then one evening in the corridor outside the state pantry, I finally asked him. I said, "Sarge, why do you always do that with the glasses?" He was holding one up to the window light. He turned it a bit, flicked it. Ting, held still, head tilted, like a man listening for a train. Then he said, "My dad made glass." I said, "Made it, like blew it." "Reeve and Son, Belgate." He said it the way you say a name you've said 10,000 times. 41 years. My granddad started it. My dad kept it going. It shut when I was 17 because you can buy a machine tumbler for 11 pence, and nobody wants to pay £4 for one that a man made. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which was the right call because he kept going. He used to test them by ear. Every one. Whole shelf of them, and he'd go along, ting, 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 and every so often he'd stop and take one out and put it in the bin, and I'd say, "What's wrong with that one, Dad? It looks fine." And he'd say, "It sings wrong." He put the glass down. "Good glass rings," he said. "It rings and it keeps ringing. It goes on for a second or two like it doesn't want to stop. Cracked glass doesn't. Cracked glass goes tuck, dead. It's the crack eating the sound. And the thing is, you can't always see the crack. Sometimes it's inside, sometimes it's a hair, but the sound knows." He tapped the side of his head. 41 years my dad did that. Then I did it from about 6. You do a thing from 6 years old and it doesn't leave. I can't not hear it, Peter. I walk past a tray of glasses and my ears do it whether I want them to or not. I remember laughing and saying something like, "That's mad, that is." And he said, and I swear this is exact, "I've had years to forget it and I haven't. Everybody's got one thing they know better than everyone in the room. Most people never find out what theirs is." Then he went and stood on his post for 2 hours in the sun and didn't move. Right the Thursday. 3 o'clock, everyone's out on the terrace. The heat is genuinely stupid now. You can see it coming up off the flagstones, that wobble in the air. The band's playing. The bishop's still got the napkin. And Princess Marian comes out. I should tell you about her briefly, because otherwise the rest of it won't land. She was the middle one, not the heir, not the baby. She'd been given the charities that nobody photographs, hospices, children's palliative care, the ones where you go in and hold somebody's hand and there's no good headline in it because there's no good ending in it. She did that for years, never made a fuss. The press called her cold, that was the line on her. Reserved, distant, difficult, because she didn't do the big warm public thing. She wasn't good at it, and she knew she wasn't good at it, and rather than fake it, she just went quiet, and the papers decided quiet meant cold. She wasn't cold. I'll give you one thing and you can decide. That spring, one of the kitchen girls, Aggie, 17, terrified of everything, dropped an entire tray of coffee cups in a corridor. Not a corridor she should have been in either. Right as the princess was coming the other way. Just crash and the whole world stops, and Aggie's standing in it going white. And the princess crouched down, in whatever it was she was wearing, crouched down in the broken china and started picking bits up. And Aggie's going, "Ma'am, please, ma'am," and the princess said, "Sit down before you faint, you've gone gray." And Aggie sat down on the floor of a state corridor next to a princess who was picking up broken cups, and that was that. It was over in 90 seconds. Nobody photographed it. Nobody ever wrote it down. Cold, they called her. Anyway, she came out onto the terrace at 3:10, and the crowd at the railings did that noise. You know the noise, that rising O. She went round the guests the way you do. 4 steps, stop, listen, nod, 4 steps, and I was on drinks. Which meant I was carrying a tray of 11 crystal tumblers of iced water, moving in a slow arc about 6 feet behind and to her left. And my job, my entire job for 2 hours, was to be exactly where a glass was wanted, half a second before anybody said they wanted one. The tumblers were the Bellwood set. Palace crystal, heavy, cut with a wheat pattern round the base. 200 years old, some of them. They came out for garden receptions and got washed by hand by a woman called Mrs. Rowe who had done it since before I was born and who once made a grown man cry for stacking one wrong. And it was hot, that matters. Everybody was drinking water like they'd walked in off a desert. I'd been out and back to the pantry 4 times already. Tray out, tray empty, tray back, reload, out again. Faster than we'd normally do it. And I have thought about this for 20 years, and I will tell you the truth. On the 4th reload, we rushed. The under-butler was loading, I was holding, and there was a queue of people going dry in the sun, and neither of us checked the way we should have. You're supposed to check. Every glass, every time held up, looked through. That's the standard. And that standard exists because 200 years ago somebody presumably found out exactly why it needs to. We didn't, we were quick instead. That's mine, I've carried that. So there I am, tray of 11, coming across the terrace at about 3:30. And Reeve is on the terrace post, which is a real post, not a decorative one. It's at the top of the steps where the terrace meets the lawn, and it's there because it's the pinch point, the place where 300 people funnel into a gap 8 feet wide. He stood there like he's been welded on, full scarlet, in that heat. I remember genuinely wondering how he was still upright. And I walk past him, maybe 4 feet away. And I hear it. Now I want to be careful here because memory does things. Memory tidies up. I've had 20 years to make myself the hero of this, and I'm not going to. What I heard was a sound. My tray had a slightly uneven foot, one of those trays that rocks if you don't hold it dead level, and going up the shallow step onto the upper terrace the glasses knocked together. That's all. A little jostle, chink, chink, chink. And in there, in the middle of the chinking, there was one that went tuck. I heard it, and my brain went nothing, absolutely nothing, filed it under noise. I was 19 and I was boiling alive in a wool jacket and I was worried about the bishop who kept trying to take 2. I walked on, and behind me, a man who had spent his childhood on a stool in a glassworks in Belgate listening to his father go ting, ting, ting along a shelf, heard the same sound and did not file it under noise. I didn't see his face at that moment. Obviously, my back was to him. But there was a woman at the railings, Denise Hallam. She works for a building society. She gave about 400 interviews afterwards, and I've read most of them. And she had her phone up filming the princess, and Reeve is in the left of the frame, and you can watch it. It's still online. 31 seconds. At around second 6, his head turns. That's it, that's the whole thing. A man in ceremonial uniform turns his head maybe 15 degrees to follow a tray of water going past. Doesn't look like anything, looks like a bloke glancing at a tray. But if you know the household guard, if you have stood next to those men for a year and a half like I had, you understand that this is roughly equivalent to a statue getting off its plinth and walking into the sea. They don't do that. The discipline is total. I once saw a wasp go down the back of a guardsman's collar during trooping, and the man did not move for 19 minutes. 19. I counted because I was 15 feet away and I couldn't look away. Reeve turned his head. And then, at about second 9, he does something else you can see if you know to look for it. He shifts his weight. Just forward, onto the balls of his feet, the way a sprinter does before the gun. He's decided something right there, second 9. I got to the far end of the terrace, turned, started back. And the princess was talking to a woman in a green hat. I found out later she was a fundraiser for a children's hospice in the north. She'd come down on the train that morning and she'd been up since 4, and the woman was crying a bit, the good kind, the overwhelmed kind, and the princess had a hand on her arm. Then she looked up, at me, and did the small lift of the eyebrows that means water, please. So I came in. I came in on her left with the tray at the correct height, and she reached out without looking, the way you do, still listening to the woman in the green hat, and her fingers closed around a heavy cut crystal tumbler of iced water with the wheat pattern round the base. And she lifted it. Everything from here happened in about 1 second. I'm going to take longer than that to tell it, and that's not me being clever, that's just how it is when a second gets sliced thin enough. Ask anyone who's been in a car crash. She lifted the glass. Somebody came past me at a speed I had genuinely never seen a human being move at. There was no shout. That's the thing everybody gets wrong when they retell it. Every version you'll read says the guard shouted. He didn't shout. He didn't say one word. There was no time for a word. A word takes half a second, and he didn't have half a second, and I've thought about it a lot. I think he'd worked that out somewhere around second 9. There was scarlet in the corner of my eye, and then there was a crack. Not the glass, his hand. The flat of his hand on the underside of her wrist, hard upward, and the tumbler went out of her fingers and straight up. And it turned over in the air once, and I watched it, and the water came out of it in a rope in the sun, and it hung there. I know it didn't hang there. I know that's my brain lying to me, but that's how I have it, a rope of water in the air with the light going through it. Absolutely beautiful, honestly the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And then the glass came down on the flagstones, and it did not break. It burst. It went off like something with a fuse in it. That's the only way I can describe it. It didn't break into pieces. It detonated into powder and shrapnel, and it threw crystal about 10 feet in every direction. And the woman in the green hat screamed, and the band stopped mid-bar, and the entire east terrace of Whitehall Palace went completely, totally silent. And I stood there holding a tray of 10 glasses with my mouth open. Here's what the crowd at the railing saw. They saw a royal guard leave his post at a sprint and strike the Princess of Ashcombe's arm. That's it, that's the entire event from 60 feet away, through a railing on a phone. Denise Hallam's video, the 31 seconds, you can hear her on it. You can hear her go very clearly, oh my God, he's hit her. 4 seconds later, somebody at the railings starts screaming. 11 seconds later, 2 of Reeves' own colleagues have him on the ground. And I want you to sit with that, because I've never been able to put it down. 4 seconds. It took 4 seconds, from the moment that man did the bravest and most correct thing I have ever seen a human being do, for 300 people to decide he'd assaulted her. He didn't fight them, not for a second. 2 men came in and took him down, and he went down like a sack, no resistance at all, face against the hot flagstones with his own regiment's knee in his back and crystal dust in his hair. And he wasn't looking at them. His head was turned sideways, and he was looking past them, at the floor, at where the glass had come down. He was looking for something. I saw his lips moving. I couldn't hear him. Everyone was shouting by then. I asked him about it, years later, what he'd been saying, face down on the ground with his career already over in his head. He said, I was saying, please be there, please be there. Because in that moment, right, he didn't know, not for certain. He had a sound. A sound he'd heard for a quarter of a second from 4 feet away, through a crowd and a band and 300 people talking, and he had bet everything he had ever built on it. And if it wasn't there, if he'd got it wrong, he'd just assaulted a princess in front of the world for nothing. The princess was standing very still. She had water down the front of her, from her collarbone to her knee, a great dark stripe of it, and her hand was up in front of her face, not covering it, just up half-raised, frozen there. She wasn't looking at Reeve. She was looking at the floor, at the mess. And I watched her face, and I saw something go across it that I did not understand at all at the time, because it wasn't fear, and it wasn't anger. It was recognition. Like she'd worked something out. Then Mr. Dunnett arrived at a run, and the private secretary, and somebody threw a jacket round her shoulders as if it were November, and they turned her and started walking her towards the terrace doors, fast, and she went 4 steps. And then she stopped. She stopped so suddenly that the private secretary walked into the back of her. And she turned around and she looked at Sergeant Callum Reeve, face down on the flagstones of her own house with 2 men holding him there. And she said, not loudly, but there was no other noise on that terrace by then, so everybody heard it, all 300 of them, and the phones caught it too. She said, don't move him, and don't let anyone touch that floor. Nobody touched the floor. That's the thing I want you to understand first, before any of the rest of it. 300 people, a bishop, 2 television crews, the household staff, the police who arrived 11 minutes later, and for 4.5 hours, nobody touched that patch of flagstone. Because she said not to. I've seen a lot of orders given at Whitehall. Most of them get half obeyed. That one didn't. Mr. Dunnett had a footman stood at each corner of it before the princess was even through the terrace doors, and one of them was me, and I stood there in the sun for 4.5 hours with a tray of 10 glasses that nobody would take off me, looking down at a mess I had carried out there myself. The terrace cleared in about 6 minutes. That's fast. 300 people is not a thing that moves fast normally. But there's a way the household clears a space that I'd only seen practiced before, never done for real, and it turns out the practice works. Doors open that guests don't know are doors. Marquee walls come down. Men in plain suits appear from nowhere. They'd been there the whole time. Obviously, they're always there. You just don't clock them until the day you need to. The band went last. I remember that. The cellist was trying to carry his cello and his stool and a music stand all at once, and a footman took the stand off him without a word, and they went off together across the burnt grass. And then it was quiet. Really quiet. Palace quiet, which is a specific thing. You get birds, and you get traffic from somewhere beyond the wall. And underneath it, this enormous stone silence like the building's holding its breath. And on the other side of the north railings, 60 feet away, 400 tourists who had not gone anywhere at all, filming. They took Reeve out through the stable arch. I saw it. His 2 colleagues had him up by then, Corporal Beatty on one arm, a lad called Voss on the other, and both of them looked absolutely sick. Voss was about 20. His face was the color of paper. Reeve didn't say anything, didn't argue, walked between them with his back straight and his eyes forward, and there was crystal dust in his hair, glittering, and one long cut down the side of his jaw where a piece had come up off the flagstones and caught him. He wasn't looking at the men holding him. He was looking at the ground the whole way, scanning it. Still looking even then. And as they got to the arch, he turned his head and found me, stood there guarding my square of floor with my stupid tray. And he did something I have thought about more than almost anything else in my life. He nodded at the tray. That's all, a little jerk of the chin, down at the 10 glasses I was holding. Then they took him through the arch, and I didn't see him again for 11 days. Here's what I didn't know at the time, and what took me years to piece together properly. Between the moment the tumbler burst and the moment the princess said, "Don't move him," about 9 seconds passed. In those 9 seconds, she had already worked it out. All of it, the whole thing. Faster than the police, faster than the household, faster than me and I was stood right there. She looked at the mess on the flagstones, and she knew exactly what she was looking at, because she had seen a report about it 4 months earlier, and she had signed a request based on that report, and the request had been refused. But I'm getting ahead. Let me do it in order the way it came out. They put me in the green room. Not green. Nothing at Whitehall is the color it's named after. The blue drawing room is the color of porridge, and nobody knows why. 2 men, one from the household, 1 police. Notebook, jug of water on the table, which, in the circumstances, struck all 3 of us at the same moment, and nobody drank any of it. And they asked me to go through it, and I did. And then the household man, very gently, in a voice like a man asking if you'd like another biscuit, said, "And when you loaded that tray, Peter, walk me through the check." And I sat there. I could have lied. It would have been easy. There were 2 of us loading and nobody was watching, and I could have said yes. I checked, held everyone up all clear, and there is not a single person alive who could have proved otherwise. I was 19. I'd been in the job 18 months. I had a mum at home who told everyone at her work that her son worked at the palace, and she'd got a bit of a name for it, and she loved it, and I knew exactly what would happen to that if I said the true thing. And I heard Reeve's voice going, "My dad made glass," and I thought about him face down on the hot stone not resisting, and I said it. I said we didn't check. We were quick instead. It was hot and there was a queue and we just went. The police one stopped writing. The household one looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "Thank you. That was the correct answer." And something happened in the room that I can't describe except to say that the temperature changed. And I want to be honest about my own head here, because this story has a hero in it and it isn't me. I didn't say it because I was brave. I said it because I was 19 and terrified, and I'd have said anything true if you'd asked me in a firm enough voice. Bravery came later, and not much of it, and not from me. They tested my 10 glasses that evening. I wasn't allowed in the room, but I was outside it, because they'd told me to wait and nobody had told me to stop waiting. So I sat on a hard chair in a corridor for 2 hours with my jacket off for the first time all day. And through the door I could hear it. Ting. Pause. Ting. Pause. 10 of them, slow. A man's fingernail on 200-year-old crystal, one at a time, with a proper gap between each so the sound could finish. And on the seventh one, I heard it go tuck. Dead flat like tapping a bit of wood. And then 3 later again, tuck. 2 more on my tray in my hands, 6 feet from her. I put my head between my knees in that corridor, and I stayed like that for a while. So what was in it? I'm going to tell you properly, because everybody who tells this story gets it wrong, and the wrong version is more exciting and the true version is worse. There was nothing in the water. Nothing, no powder, no drop, no poison, no plot. The water was water. It came out of a tap in the state pantry, same tap as every glass on that terrace, and it had ice in it from the same machine. The danger was in the glass. The Bellwood tumblers were made in 1808. Hand-cut lead crystal, heavy as a hammer, beautiful. And over 200 years, a certain number of them had developed what the report afterwards called internal stress fractures with no surface expression. Which means a crack inside the glass, living in the thickness of the wall between the outside and the inside, not on the surface. Not visible, you could hold one up to a window and turn it in the light for a full minute and see nothing at all, because there is nothing to see. It's inside. They come from age, from 200 years of being washed and knocked and stacked and heated and cooled, over and over, thousands of times, each one doing a tiny bit of damage that never quite goes away. And a glass like that will sit on a shelf for a decade and do nothing. Until you shock it. You take it out of a cool stone pantry in a 100-degree heat wave, and you stand it on a metal tray in direct sun for 4 minutes while a footman walks about with it. The outer wall heats up, expands. Then you fill it with iced water. The inside wall goes cold and contracts. The outside is hot and expanded. And now you've got a piece of 200-year-old lead crystal with a hidden crack in it being pulled in 2 directions at once. And the crack is where all that force goes, and the crack starts to travel. And then somebody picks it up, and the warmth of a human hand goes into it, and the crack finds the last bit of it needs. They don't crack, that's what nobody understands. Lead crystal under that kind of stress doesn't crack, it releases. All 200 years of it at once in about 4/1000ths of a second. It took a chip out of the flagstone, out of stone. And the woman was about to raise it to her mouth. The report, I've read it. They made it public in the end. That's a whole other part of this story. The report has a line in it that I've never forgotten. It's written in that flat civil service way that makes it 100 times worse. It says that if the vessel had failed at the point of intended use, the resulting injuries would have been consistent with a fragmentation event at close range to the face and throat, with a low expectation of full recovery. Face and throat. A princess on a terrace, in front of 300 people and 2 television cameras and her own mother. And there'd have been no villain. That's the bit that gets me. No plot, no attacker, nobody to blame in any satisfying way, just a beautiful old glass and a hot day and some ice. She'd have been on the floor of her own house in front of the world, and it would have been nobody's fault. And Mr. Dunnett would have gone on television and said the word tragic accident, and everyone would have believed him. Because it would have been true. Now, the 4 months earlier bit. In the March of that year, one of the Bellwood tumblers came apart in the state pantry. Not in anyone's hand. On a shelf. Mrs. Rowe put it down after washing and turned away, and it went off behind her like a shotgun and put a piece of crystal through her forearm, and she needed 11 stitches, and she was back at work in 5 days because she was Mrs. Rowe. And Mrs. Rowe, who had washed those glasses by hand for 31 years, who knew that set better than any human being alive, wrote it up. She wrote a memorandum, on paper, in biro. I've seen a copy. It's 2 paragraphs and it's the plainest bit of English you'll ever read. It says the Bellwood set is old. It says she has noticed 3 of them have gone quiet when tapped. It says she believes they are not safe for use with iced water in warm weather. It requests they be withdrawn from service and kept for display. That memo went up. It went to a committee. There was a committee, obviously. There is always a committee. And the committee considered it. And the committee noted that the Bellwood set was of significant heritage value. And that withdrawal would require sourcing and funding a replacement service of 200 pieces at a cost the committee described as not currently supportable, and that no such failure had been recorded in the preceding 40 years. And the committee said no. And here's the part. The request came back through the princess's office, because she chaired a household standards thing that nobody cared about, and that got given to her the way all the boring ones got given to her. And she read Mrs. Rowe's 2 paragraphs, and she wrote on it in her own hand. I agree with Mrs. Rowe, please withdraw them. And she sent it back up. And she was overruled on cost. 4 months before a footman put one in her hand. That's what was on her face. I've watched that video more times than is healthy. Denise Hallam's 31 seconds and the other 4 angles that came out later. And there's a frame, you can find it, it's the famous one, it's been on the front of everything, where she stood there soaked through with her hand still half up in the air. And every single newspaper printed that frame, and every single one of them said the same word underneath it. Shock. It isn't shock. I was 8 feet away, and I'm telling you it isn't shock. That's a woman who has just been proved right in the worst way it is possible to be proved right. That's a woman doing arithmetic. That's a woman thinking. I wrote it down. I wrote it down in March, and they told me no, and it was me, it was going to be me, and if it had been the girl who brought it out instead. 9 seconds. Then, don't move him and don't let anyone touch that floor. She wasn't protecting Reeve, not first. She was protecting the evidence. Meanwhile, Sergeant Callum Reeve was in a room in the barracks block with his phone in a bag, and a corporal outside the door. Suspended, not arrested, that came close, apparently closer than anyone will admit now, but not arrested. Suspended pending investigation, confined to quarters, no contact. He was in that room for 4 days. I've asked him about those 4 days exactly once, about 6 years afterwards in a pub in Belgate, and he answered me, and then he changed the subject, and I never asked again. He said, I didn't know. He said, nobody told me anything. That's not cruelty, that's just how it works. You can't tell a man anything while the investigation's live, so they don't. But nobody told me. 4 days. And in 4 days a man can build a lot. He said he sat on the bed and went through it, over and over. The sound, 4 feet, a quarter of a second, a band playing, 300 people talking, and a tuck-in among the chinking. And every hour that went past with nobody telling him anything, the sound got quieter in his head. By the second night, he said, I'd talked myself out of it completely. I sat there and I thought, you didn't hear it. You wanted to hear it. 14 years you've been stood on a step being furniture, and some bit of you wanted to matter, and you invented it, and you ran across a terrace, and you hit a woman's arm in front of the world because you needed to be your father's son for 4 seconds. He said that. Sat in a pub with a pint he'd barely touched, saying that. And the press, obviously. Day 1 it was on everything. That footage was on every screen in the country by 6 o'clock, guard STRIKES princess. And by day 2 there were 4 other angles and a slow-motion version, and a man with a pointer on a morning show explaining the arc of the arm. Day 2 they had his name. Day 3 they had his mum's road. They doorstepped her. 68 years old, widow, lives in a terraced house in Belgate about 400 yards from where the glassworks used to be. 14 of them on her front path. And she came out and stood on her own step, and one of them shouted did she have anything to say about her son attacking the princess. And she said, you've got it wrong. And they said, how do you know? And she said, because I know him. And they printed that as Mum. He's a good boy, next to a photo of her looking 68 and frightened, and Callum Reeve did not see any of it because his phone was in a bag, and that is the only mercy in the entire 4 days. And the household did what the household does, which is nothing loudly. I understand it better now than I did then. I was 19 and I thought they were cowards. They weren't cowards. They were institutional, which is worse, because a coward at least knows he's frightened. Here's the position they were in. The truth was, our glassware nearly killed her. A woman told us 4 months ago, the princess agreed with the woman, and we said no because of the money. That is not a survivable sentence. That sentence ends careers in a straight line all the way to the top of the building. Whereas the alternative story was already written, already filmed, already on every front page, and cost them nothing at all. A guardsman had an episode in the heat. Nobody sat in a room and said, let's frame him. I want to be fair. Nobody said that, that's not how it happens. What happens is that a lot of decent, tired people each make one small, reasonable-sounding decision in a corridor, and the small decisions stack up. And at the bottom of the stack, there's a man in a barracks room talking himself into believing he's mad. Day 4, they put out a statement, 41 words. I could recite it in my sleep. It said Her Royal Highness was unharmed. It said a member of the household guard had been suspended pending an internal investigation. It said the household would not comment further. That's it, that's all of it. Not one word about a glass. They gave him to the wolves by simply not mentioning the thing that would have saved him. And it was all true. Every word was true. That's the trick of it. You can destroy a man entirely with true sentences, so long as you're careful about which ones you leave out. The corporal on the door let him read it, slid the paper under. And Reeve read 41 words about himself and sat back down on the bed and understood completely that it was over. 14 years. His father's name on a shop sign in Belgate and his own name, now under a photograph forever as the man who hit her. He said the strangest thing about that moment. He said he wasn't angry. He said, I remember thinking, well, at least I heard it. At least I did hear it. Even if I'm the only one who ever knows that, Dad'd have heard it too. And then he said, and then I thought, unless I didn't. Now, everything I've told you so far, I either saw or found out later from paper. What comes next I got from Beatty, who got it from the corporal on the door, and there are maybe 5 people alive who know it happened, and I have checked it 3 separate ways because I didn't believe it either. On the 4th night, at about 10:20, a door opened at the far end of the barracks corridor. The corporal on the door, a lad called Sims, 22, looked up. And coming down that corridor, alone, no private secretary, no protection officer, no anybody, in a jumper and flat shoes, with a brown cardboard folder under her arm, was Princess Marian. Sims said afterwards he did the only thing his brain could produce, which was stand up so fast he hit his head on a pipe. And she stopped in front of him and she said, Corporal, is he awake? And Sims, and God love him for this, Sims said, Ma'am, I'm not permitted to. And she said, I know, I'm not permitted either. And she stood there. And after a moment she said, quietly, he heard it and I didn't do anything about it, and I had 4 months and a piece of paper, and I was the only person in this building who agreed with her. So he's going to be told, tonight, and it's going to be me that tells him. And Sims stepped aside. I wasn't in that room. I want to say that plainly before I tell you what was said in it, because I've got no patience for people who tell you things as if they were there when they weren't. I got it from Reeve, years later, in a pub. And I got the outside of it from Sims, who stood in that corridor for 40 minutes with his back to a door he was not permitted to have opened. So this is second-hand, but it's second-hand from the 2 men it happened to, and I'd put that against most first-hand accounts of anything. She didn't knock. Sims said that's the bit he thinks about. She didn't knock. She just opened the door and went in, and he pulled it shut behind her because he didn't know what else to do with his hands. Reeve was sat on the bed, 4 days in a room with a window that looked at a wall. He'd shaved that morning out of habit, which he said afterwards was the maddest thing he did the entire week. A man whose life has ended getting up and shaving because it was 7 o'clock. He looked up, and there was the Princess of Ashcombe in a gray jumper with a cardboard folder under her arm. He said his first thought, his actual honest first thought was, oh, she's come to look at me. Like you'd go and look at a dog that had bitten someone. He stood up. 14 years of training will get you off a bed no matter what's going on in your head. He stood up, and he got his hands by his sides, and he waited. And she said, sit down, Sergeant. And he didn't because you don't. And she looked at him for a second, and then she said, I'm asking you to sit down because I'm going to be here a while and my back hurts, and I can't sit while you're standing, and I've had the worst week of my adult life. So he sat, and she sat on the one chair, and she put the folder on her knees, and she said, you were right. He said he didn't understand it. That's what he told me. He said the words went in and did nothing. He said it was like she'd spoken French at me. He said, ma'am. And she opened the folder and she took out a photograph, a big one, glossy, the sort the police print, and she leaned forward and put it in his hands. It was the flagstone, taken about an hour after from directly above with a little numbered marker next to it. And in the middle of the stone there was a chip, a proper one, a gouge out of 200-year-old paving about the size of a thumbnail. And she said, "That's what the glass did to the floor." She let him look at it. Then she said, "Now think about where it was going." He said he didn't say anything for a long time. He said he sat on the edge of that bed holding a photograph of a chipped stone, and he could not make his throat work. And she waited. She didn't fill it. He said that was the thing. She just sat there in silence and let a grown man come apart in front of her and didn't say a single soothing word, because a soothing word would have been about her being kind and not about him being all right, and she seemed to know the difference. Eventually he got out. There was nothing in the water. And she said, "No, nothing in the water, it was the glass. It was always going to be the glass." And then she told him, all of it, internal stress fracture, no surface expression. Hot tray, iced water, 200 years of washing up. Fragmentation event at close range to the face and throat. And Reeve, and this is why I love the man, Reeve's response to being told he'd saved a princess's life was to say, "Ma'am, I need to tell you something. I heard it once, a quarter of a second. I've spent 4 days deciding I made it up." And she said, "I know. That's why I came at 10:30 at night instead of sending someone in the morning." Then she took out the second thing in the folder. Mrs. Rowe's memo, 2 paragraphs, biro. And Reeve read it, and he got to the bit where a woman who'd washed those glasses for 31 years wrote that 3 of them had gone quiet when tapped, and he stopped. He said he had to put it down on the bed. Because his father had been dead 9 years by then, and the glassworks had been a carpet showroom for over a decade. And there was a woman 4 floors below him in the same building who had never met his father and never would, and she had written down the exact same sentence. "Gone quiet when tapped." He said, "There's 2 of us." And the princess said, "There's 2 of you, and I was told no." And she turned the page over and showed him the back of it, where somebody 4 months earlier had written, "I agree with Mrs. Rowe. Please withdraw them," in a small, upright hand. And underneath it, a line in a different pen, noted, "Not currently supportable." He asked her why she was showing him that. And she said Sims heard this bit through the door, because her voice went up for 1 sentence and only one. She said, "Because when this comes out, it is going to come out properly, not the half of it that makes me look like a woman who nearly got hurt. The half where I signed a piece of paper and let it go when they told me no. I had 4 months, Sergeant. You had a quarter of a second. Don't let anybody tell you which of us did the harder thing." And then she went quiet again. And she said, "I need you to be able to survive what happens next, so you need to know the whole of it before anyone else does." She was there about 40 minutes. The last thing Reeve said was the strangest. She stood up to go and she got to the door and then she stopped with her hand on it, and she said, without turning round, "Your father, the glassworks, what was it called?" And he said, "Reeve and Son, ma'am, Belgate." And she said, "Reeve and Son." And she said it again, quietly, like she was putting it somewhere. Then she went out, and Sims nearly took the pipe with his head a second time, and she walked back down that corridor alone in a gray jumper at 11 o'clock at night. Right, what happened next? The household's plan, such as it was to let the investigation run its course. 6 weeks minimum, probably 8. Findings in due course. Statement at the end, carefully worded, everybody quietly reinstated, no admissions. 8 weeks of guard strikes princess on every front page in the country, and then a statement on a Friday afternoon in August that nobody would read. That was the plan, nobody chose it. It just was the plan, the way a river doesn't choose the sea. It lasted 6 days. And it wasn't the princess who broke it, though God knows she was working on it. It wasn't me. I was 19 and I'd have been out on the pavement by tea time if I'd opened my mouth, and I knew it, and I'd like to tell you I was building up to it, and I don't think I was. It was Mrs. Rowe. Mrs. Rowe was 64 years old, 31 years in the state pantry, 11 stitches in her forearm from March that she'd never once mentioned to anyone who didn't ask. And on the Wednesday, 6 days after, she put her coat on over her apron in the middle of her shift and walked out of the tradesman's gate at the back of Whitehall Palace. And she went up to the north railings where the press pack had been camped for 6 days, and she said, "My name's Eileen Rowe. I wash the glasses." I'm told there was about 4 seconds where nobody moved because nobody could believe it. And then it was carnage. She had a copy of the memo, Of course she had a copy of the memo. She'd been keeping copies of things for 31 years because she'd worked in an institution for 31 years, and she knew exactly what an institution does to a person who hasn't kept copies. And she stood on a public pavement in front of about 40 journalists and read her own 2 paragraphs out loud in a Belgate accent. And then she said the thing that ended it. She said, "That man heard what I heard, and I've been listening to them for 31 years, and he did it in a second from 4 feet with a band playing. Now you can put that in your paper or you cannot, but I'm not standing here another day letting you call him mad." Then she got the bus home. It was over in about 4 hours. There's no fighting a thing like that. You can manage a princess, and you can manage a guardsman, and you cannot manage a 64-year-old woman with a photocopy and 31 years of standing. By 6 o'clock, every channel had it. By 8, the memo was on screens with the not currently supportable lines circled in red. By the following morning, 3 separate papers that had run Guard Strikes Princess on Friday were running the man who saved her on Thursday, with no acknowledgement whatsoever that they'd ever said anything else, which is a trick I have never got over. The household put out a second statement on the Thursday afternoon, 210 words this time. Sergeant Reeve was reinstated with immediate effect and with the household's full confidence. His actions were described as exemplary. A full independent review of all household glassware would be conducted. The Bellwood service was withdrawn from use permanently. 210 words, and not one of them was sorry. The princess said it instead. 10 days later, at the front of a hospice appeal she'd been booked into for a year, nothing to do with any of it. She went off the notes for about 90 seconds. Somebody filmed it, obviously. It's the other famous clip. She said Mrs. Rowe's name first, before Reeves' first name in the whole thing. She said, "A woman who has washed our glasses for 31 years told us they were dangerous in writing in March." I agreed with her. I was overruled on cost, and I let it go, because that is what you do when you are overruled and you would rather not make a fuss. 4 months later, one of them was in my hand. And then she said, "I want to be very clear about what happened on that terrace, because a great deal has been written about it. Sergeant Reeve did not save me from an attacker. There was no attacker. He saved me from us, from this household and from its committees and from me. And he did it in less than a second with no information at the cost of everything he had because he trusted something he knew and nobody else in that garden did." And then she stopped and looked at her notes for a moment and said one more thing quietly, and this is the line that ended up on the front of everything. The only person on that terrace who was actually listening was the one we'd all agreed was furniture. Right. The last bit where everyone ends up, and then I'll stop. Mrs. Rowe did not get sacked, which I think surprised even her. She stayed another 2 years and retired properly, with a due, in the servants' hall, and Mr. Dunnett made a speech about her that went on 11 minutes and was, I am told, the only time in his 40-year career that anybody saw his face do anything. She got given a piece of the Bellwood service when it was withdrawn. A single tumbler. A sound one, they checked it, obviously, 3 times with a machine and then with a person. She kept it on a shelf, never drank out of it. She said, I know too much. She died 5 years ago. There were 400 people at it, and the front 2 rows were household staff. And there was a man in the 3rd row in a gray suit who nobody in the press recognized and who was Callum Reeve. Princess Marian stayed exactly what she was. The papers had about a fortnight of calling her brave and warm, and then they went back to reserved, distant, difficult, because that's the peg she was on and papers don't change pegs. She did one thing, though, that never got written up anywhere. The Household Standards Committee, the boring one nobody wanted, she kept it. She could have handed it off after all that and nobody would have blinked. She kept it for another 11 years, and she chaired it herself in person, and I am told by people who sat on it that it became the single most feared meeting in the building. Because she had a question she asked, every time, every proposal. And who did we ask who actually does it? That's it, that's the whole legacy. One question in a boring room for 11 years. I think that's better than most of what gets put on statues, personally. Me, I stayed 4 more years. Then I left and did something else, and I'm not going to bore you with it because it isn't interesting and it isn't this. I checked glasses, though. Everyone. Every time, held up, looked through, and when nobody's watching, flicked once with a fingernail. Ting. My wife thinks it's a nervous habit. I've told her the story. She's heard it 4 times. She still thinks it's a nervous habit. And Reeve. He went back on the post. That's the thing. 2 days after Mrs. Rowe got the bus home, Sergeant Callum Reeve put the scarlet on and went and stood at the top of the terrace steps at Whitehall Palace like nothing had happened. And there were about 600 people at the north railings by then, and they all clapped him. He didn't move, obviously. He did another 8 years and got out at 38, which is normal, and he's a school caretaker now in Belgate, about half a mile from where the works used to be. Fixes things, unblocks sinks, knows every child's name in a school of 400. I asked him once, that same night in the pub, whether he ever wondered what would have happened if he'd been wrong. And he had to think about it, and he said, "I was wrong." I said, "You weren't, though. You were right. It's on film." And he said, "No, listen. At second 9, I didn't know. That's the whole thing. I didn't know. I heard a noise, and I had a quarter of a second, and I went. And if the tray had been fine, I'd have been exactly the same man doing exactly the same thing, and they'd have put me away, and they'd have been right to. Being right isn't the bit that counts. Being right's luck." And I said, "Well then, what is the bit that counts?" And he turned his glass round on the table for a while. And he said, "Whether you go. Here's the thing I can't get past. 20 years and I can't put it down." Everyone on that terrace was looking at her. 300 people, 2 cameras, 400 tourists at the railings, all of them looking at the same woman in the same 6 square feet of sunlight. That's what we were all there for. That's what the whole afternoon was. And in all that looking, not one of us saw a thing. The danger wasn't hiding. That's what gets me. It was in plain sight, on a silver tray, in a footman's hands, in the middle of a garden party, and it had been on a piece of paper in a filing cabinet for 4 months with a princess's own handwriting on it, and it went round that terrace for half an hour and everybody smiled at it. It didn't take a clever man to find it. It didn't take a plot or a search or a machine. It took one bloke, stood still on a step, in a red coat, being ignored by everyone, who'd been taught at 6 years old by a man in a glassworks that a thing can look perfect and be broken all the way through, and that the only way you'll ever know is if you shut up long enough to listen. We put a man at the top of those steps so we could all feel safe. Turns out he was the only one of us actually doing it.